So let's start by just recapping Socrates' answer, right? So here we are. So it's where he's making this defense of himself before the real jury. For Simus and Cebes, I should um, be wrong not to resent dying if I did not believe that I should go first to other wise and good gods, and then to men who have died and are better than the men that are here. Be assured that, as it is, I expect to join the company of good men. This last I would not altogether insist on. But if I insist on anything at all in these matters, it is that I shall come to gods who are very good masters. That is why I am not so resentful, because I have good hope that some future awaits men after death, as we have been told for years, a much better future for the good than the wicked. Okay, so we were at paragraph 42, right? We just discussed this yonder, which is the world beyond, the intelligible.
Hmm.
And now we get to 43. So you can read 43.
Okay, 43 says there are two arguments and two hypothetical propositions, one of which begins with gods and ends with men. Not sure what he means. Second, the other way. The one imitates precession, the other reversion.
Right. So this is indeed confusing. How does he get two arguments out of this passage? So let's go back to it. So you see, here we can see something that I should be wrong not to resent dying if I did not believe that I should go first to other wise and good gods, and then to men who have died and are better than men are here. So here we have a more complete reconstruction of this in Olympiodorus, right? Which is the first is if I did not believe that I'm going to be better masters and friends, I should be wrong to die without regret. That I believe that I am going to better masters and friends, therefore I am not wrong to grieve, right? So that's one hypothetical argument, and this is what um, begins with gods and ends with men, right? So, right, I guess here the it begins with gods in the sense that the hypothetical is if I did not believe that I'm going to better masters, the masters are the gods, right?
Hmm.
And then the second premise is, but I think I am, and that's something about himself, a mortal, a human being. The next one he reconstructs as if I am going to better masters, friends, and masters, it is right that I should die without regret. The former is true, therefore so is the latter. Um, so this here it corresponds to um, be assured that as it is, I expect to join the company of good men. This last I would not altogether insist on, but if I insist on anything on all of these matters, it is that I shall come to gods who are very good masters. That is why I am not so resentful, because I have good hope that some future awaits men after death, as we have been told for years, a much better future for the good than for the wicked. I think here the idea is that if um, if you are good, you will go to um, gods. I have been good, so I'll go to gods, right? So here it begins with men because it begins with your own conduct. So because they're so, and that imitates reversion. So there are 2 points here. There's one, and it's a bit contrived, really, but the idea is that, so since this is both in Olympiodorus and Damascus, we know this is an argument of Proclus's, and his idea is that there's one argument here which is about how the gods in this the gods that you go to as after death, so when you're free, are superior to the gods that control and create your body. And therefore, that's one reason to be happy, and that has to do with procession, I guess, because you're talking about the cause, different levels of cause. The other one is about, well, going to better gods is part of the reward for virtue, and therefore it's about procession, right? That's just the idea. But it is a bit, um, yeah, it's a bit contrived, I think.
Okay. Um,
We can,
so 44. So I'm 40, yeah, 44. The whole reasoning of Socrates proceeds by taking 4 points for granted. Two of these relate to the gods, meaning that the gods take care of men, and that there are two kinds of deities, those in charge of generation and those in charge of ungenerated life. Okay. The other two concern man, is the belief that souls continue to exist when separated from their body. That's one thing, and that this right, the continuing, and this possibility of a separate existence is part of their nature. And secondly, that Socrates hopes to be able to join them himself. Okay.
right. So that's commenting on the previous arguments. Uh, Generation here means generation of destruction, so the world of mortal things, and ungenerated then would be, which is not part of that. Not that it doesn't have any other causes. And he adds that this possibility of a separate existence is part of their nature, because separation could be violent, right? It could be like you're ripping the soul away from the body, and the natural thing is for it to be with the body.
Mm.
Something like Thomists will sometimes say things like that, and be arguing for the resurrection.
Hmm.
Um, that they'll even get to the point of calling like souls, disembodied souls, Frankensteins and things like that. But of course, the Neoplatonic theory is that that's not the case, at least for the mortal body. Um, okay. And again, right, so the first thing has to do, and then this reflects the arguments that we just saw that he reconstructed here. One that's about going to the higher kind of deity, and the other is that the good soul can join the gods.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah, but okay, good. Now, 45. Why is Socrates so positive that he will come to good gods, but less sure where men are concerned? So he's not sure they will come to good men.
Yeah, he says
It says the
here,
last I would
um,
not insist on. Okay.
yeah, yeah,
Because the condition for the latter is an exemplary life, so joining the good men. And whether he has achieved this, he will learn only, he says, upon his arrival yonder. 4. The standards by which human nature measures are too indulgent. And we must be careful, as he says later, that no malign influence bring our words to naught. So that's interesting. And besides, we need many others to protect us from aspiring to higher plane of life. Not
right.
sure what that means. But in whatever state we are, worse or better, we are certainly under all circumstances under the care of the gods.
R- Right. So the argument here is like he's sure he'll come to good gods because he'll come to gods that take care just of souls, and those are better gods. So that's why he's sure he's going to good gods. Now, why is he good? He's not so sure that he's going to go to good men because he could come to the good gods, and the good gods judge him. You've led a bad life, and so you're going to go with the bad men. And so he says he's in he so that in that sense he will learn only upon his arrival yonder. Only when he gets there will he know that he's led a good life. Will he be truly judged? Why is that? On the one hand, there's a question like as a human being, he's not sure. Also, because that we must be sure that no malign influence brings our word to naught. So let me stop the share here. So that's a 95b. Oh, that's much later in the text. That has to do with I think that's already in the myth, is that right? Um, no, he's discussing the argument from harmony, and he says, um, oh, and this is not something that Socrates says. This is, I know this is something that Socrates says when he's discussing with Cebes. He says, "My good sir, do not boast, lest some malign influence upset the argument we are about to make. However, we leave that to the care of the god. But let us come to grips with it in the Homeric fashion to see if there's anything in what you say. The sum of your problem is this: you consider that the soul must be proved to be immortal and indestructible before a philosopher on the point of death, who is confident that he will fare much better in the underworld than if he had led any other kind of life." Right? So the question here is if the soul is just a harmony, right, as and also there's the that it wouldn't survive the death of body. But if you even if you prove that it's not a harmony and that it survives something, you haven't shown that it survives forever, right? And so here there's this malign influence that has to be avoided with the care of the god. And I take it that Proclus is um, concerned here, perhaps, of a material daimon that draws us to material things and therefore corrupts our judgment. So that's the question why he's not so sure that he's good, because our judgment of our own moral character is influenced, for instance, by, among other things, not just because humans are fallible, but there are these daimones that want to convince people to lead bad lives. And naturally, part of that is making them think that they're leading good lives when they're leading bad lives.
Hmm.
Mm.
Okay, but the separation, so the separation from the body is not something he's in doubt about, like that he
Uh,
wants to die, which is like basically what it means to be good in the purificatory or philosophical sense. That he's not really worried about that, but he does think that even after that, there's some, right? You got my question?
yeah,
Like
yeah,
being
yeah.
being happy
Yeah,
to die is already like all the virtue, at least in the purificatory sense of the Phaedo.
right. But I guess the question is, of course, that you could. So I guess he's certain about, maybe he's certain, like, he knows that he's put himself this goal uh, of like this moral goal. And I guess like the arguments convince him that, right, this is what you should want. You should want to die. But he might be erring in thinking that he's achieved this, right? Verifying this. Um, like cases of, oh, I don't know, I guess, you could think that you're leading a purificatory life, but you're just being a coward, something like that. Um, so, so that's the sum of Damascus's discussion of this first answer of Socrates. And then he there's a little narrative bit where he gets interrupted by the jailer. So um, he's just mentioned this belief that he's going to meet better men and gods. Well, now, Socrates, said Simmias, do you intend to keep this belief to yourself as you leave us, or would you share it with us? I certainly think it would be a blessing for us too, and at the same time, it would be your defense if you convince us of what you say. I will try, he said. First, let us see what it is that Crito here has, I think, been wanting to take for quite a while. What else, Socrates, said Crito, but what the man who is to give you the poison has been telling me for some time, that I should warn you to talk as little as possible. People get heated when they talk, he says, and one should not be heated when taking the poison, as those who do must sometimes drink it 2 or 3 times. Socrates replied, take no notice of him. Only let him be prepared to administer it twice, or if necessary, 3 times. I was rather sure he would say that, Crito said, but he has been bothering me for some time. Okay. So there's some commentary on this little passage. 46, 47.
Okay. So 46 says, every form strives to assimilate to itself what is capable of being so assimilated and impose on it a form similar to its own. This is the reason why matter-bound diamonds endeavor, it says demons here, endeavor to keep souls in their grip. And the man who is going to administer the poison and who now interrupts the discussion plays a part comparable to their. Okay, so he's literally the executioner, which doesn't
Right.
sound like a good job.
It doesn't sound like a good job, but yeah, it's like the matter about daimonists. They don't have a good job. They're sending people down, right?
Mhm.
Down the scale of being. It's also interesting that, of course, he he gives the cup to for Socrates to drink. So is what we talked about earlier about how, in some sense, it's a suicide, right? Because
Mhm.
Socrates could just refuse, and then you have to, I don't know, stab him or something like that. And and so in that sense, it's he's trying to assimilate um, Socrates to his own form, and he keeps bothering Crito, so it's like a constant nuisance. He's constantly trying to assimilate Socrates to his, and he's also trying to make his job easy, right? He wants if Socrates talks too much, his body will get hot, and therefore it'll just be more difficult. He'll just have to also give him like 2 or 3 times the poison. So um, that's um, uh, that's the thing. Also, it could be the analogy between the matter-bound demons and the executioner is that if you lead an irrational life, you lead a life that's closer to the body, where you just react more to bodily stimuli, and you don't, act from your own internal essence as a soul as much. And in that sense, to be a metaphor for that is like you become a dead corpse, right? So, and that's the reason. Okay, now 47.
Right. Okay. And 47. Socrates teaches us what our attitude towards these demons ought to be. So in the first place, not to pay attention to them. So that's like whoever was ignoring him, and he has to like tell him like he's been trying to get your attention. Secondly, not to struggle violently against them, but let them be. Okay. And that's from something I don't know. Thirdly, not to oppose their actions when they're rented on something that merely belongs to us, or to abandon to them something else instead, on which their menace can spend itself.
Right. So as these, the material diamond, as they manifest themselves in imaginations and thoughts that they produce in us, or also perhaps, opportunities and the circumstances around us. And so the first thing is that you just don't pay attention to these temptations, right?
Hmm.
Um, if, if the if the temptation that presents itself, you don't struggle violently against it. So, oh, I shouldn't eat that candy. I shouldn't eat that candy. You just, okay, I have a desire to eat candy, but there are more overall things. Um, and the third is so not to oppose their actions when directed on something that merely belongs to us. So that would be typically the body or perhaps a possession, right? Or to abandon to them something else instead on which their mention can spend itself. So this can be like, this sounds a bit like some kind of Hippotropaic ritual where, for instance, you feed the daimonis something with like a sacrifice, and they take care of that. And I guess also um, the idea might be when their actions are directed against something that belongs to us, what would that be? I guess it might be something like that they destroy something that belongs to you, and then you don't oppose it. So Proclus on Providence talks about when his house was burned down. That might be uh, that might be it. There's let me just see here if there's uh, extra. Uh, he says later to take a look at the Olympiodorus, the translator. So I'll check that later.
Okay.
Hmm.
Okay. Um,
So that was what he has to say about the interruption by the jailer. Um, Now he moves on to Socrates on the philosopher's will to die. So let's take a look at that next passage. So this is
okay.
likely a longer passage. So, right. So Socrates says, "Let him be," he said. "I want to make my argument before you, my judges, as to why I think that a man who has truly spent his life in philosophy is probably right to be of good cheer in the face of death, and to be very hopeful that after death he will attain the greatest blessings yonder. I will try to tell you, Seamus and Civius, how this may be so. I am afraid that other people do not realize that the one aim of those who practice philosophy in the proper manner is to practice for dying and death, right? So this is something that Damascus will comment on. Why dying and death? Now, if this is true, it would be strange indeed if they were eager for this all their lives and then resent it when they have wanted and practiced for a long time comes upon them. Simmias laughed and said, "By Zeus, Socrates, you made me laugh, though I was in no laughing mood just now. I think the majority on hearing this will think that it describes the philosophers very well. And our people in Thebes would thoroughly agree that philosophers are nearly dead, and that the majority of men is well aware that they deserve to be." Right? So, like, there's a there's a joke here about, Socrates has been condemned to death for practicing philosophy, and that's
Mhm.
his view. And then asked about like, oh, what does the philosopher want? He says, well, obviously he's just practicing to die. Um, and they wouldn't be telling the truth, Simmias, says Socrates, except for their being aware. They are not aware of the way true philosophers are nearly dead, nor of the way they deserve to be, nor of the sort of death they deserve. Remember, this is one of the flaws in CB's argument that Damascus pointed out. That so CB's made the argument, um, if we have good masters, we should not want to flee them. The philosopher wants to flee them, therefore the philosopher is not a philosopher, something like that. And one of the things that Damascus says that he has not specified the way that the philosopher wants to die. But never mind them, he said. Let us talk amongst ourselves. Do we believe that there is such a thing as death? Right? Then that starts the next part of the speech, which is this short syllogism on death. But he has some uh, things to say about this will to die.
Okay. So, 48. There are three kinds of hope: that of the crowd, that of the philosopher, and of the theurgist.
Right.
49. If our aim is to detach the soul from the body and to achieve complete detachment, the latter being the final goal, the former being the way to the goal and a pursuit, Not sure what the difference between these two things is. Is the complete detachment is, I guess, the goal. Um, and if achieving one's end always causes joy, it is not ridiculous to think that the philosopher alone should grieve when he. Is it not ridiculous to think that the philosopher alone should grieve when he attains his own goal? The major premise is self-evident, meaning that someone is happy when he achieves his goal. The minor
Yes.
is substantiated at greater length.
Right. So just some comments. First of all, the three kinds of hope, right? So the philosopher, I mean, the crowd, the philosopher, and the theurgist. So the crowd here might be, the hope of just having a good life and being happy here, right? The philosopher's hope is separating the soul from the body and knowing the forms, and something like that. The theurgist's hope will be something about like the joining the gods, especially the Chaldeans talk about the Chaldean oracle talk about hope as a virtue, and also they have these ceremonies to separate the soul from the body and to make it ascend to the gods, and that's probably the hope of the theurgist. Also, just a linguistic note, Damascus doesn't use the word theurgy. He uses hieratic, so priestly art. So it's a bit broader that because it seems to imply anything that any priest does, whereas theurgy can be connected specifically to this Chaldean tradition. Now, the you asked first of all, are the difference between to detach the soul from the body and to achieve complete detachment. Um, I think and he says that the latter, complete detachment, is the final goal, and the former, to detach the soul from the body, a way to the goal in a pursuit. So I think so so he's saying, well, another way of uh, phrasing this would be to, if our aim is to separate the soul from the body and to finally separate it. So there's one thing which is the activity you're separating, the other is the result. This um, reflects later the to die and to be dead, right? Um, So that's the two things. So one is, the philosopher not eating, drinking, separating himself from pleasures and dedicating himself to the forms, but the actual thing will only happen when he actually dies. Right.
Okay. Um, okay, so now, where are we?
50.
50. Vice is ignorant both of itself and of virtue, while virtue knows both itself and vice. Interesting. Therefore, most people do not realize the condition of philosophers, but they themselves are well aware of it, so that they will meet death gladly when it comes. Okay.
Yeah. So since most people don't even conceive of the philosophical life, they don't understand how what it means when that the philosophers are dying and want to die, deserve death.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Um, why to die is 51. Why to die and to be dead? Because purification is twofold. It may mean either to become pure or to be pure. Okay.
Right. So that's Proclus's interpretation, where it's a bit allegorical, right? Because he's immediately interpreting dying and being dead as purification. Damascus will then correct it. I mean, he'll have more down to earth. It's just about the aspect of the verb. Right.
Okay. Or the phrase may have been chosen to mark off the end as distinct from the action, and the action is incomplete and directed towards the end. There's not indeed with every action that we aim at having completed it. For example, in the case of intellection, we want to exercise this faculty always, not to have exercised it, because in this case there's no other goal. Similarly with prayer, which has its own perfection. If yuchestai means to a ikastai, then then the activity would be the goal. So,
Yeah,
so in other words, it's possible maybe in some, if we're talking about an activity which is its own perfection, then to become dead would be the same as to be dead.
right. So he is making the point that purification is a process, right? This might be relevant, for instance, for also distinguishing the purificatory virtues from the contemplative virtues, because the purificatory virtues are about a process of separating yourself from the body, whereas the contemplative virtues are about an activity that you fulfill, having a separate existence from the body. Mm. And also just the And of course, intellection is a classic case of this. Also, seeing, right, in Aristotle, but you understand and you have understood always at the same time, right? So having understood is not a separate thing. But the thing about prayer is interesting, and um, it has all because you might think that prayer is a process. You pray and then the prayer is fulfilled or it is not fulfilled, right? So like you're asking something and they give and the gods give you it to or not. But but here the idea is that praying just is clinging to the good, clinging to the gods. And one of the things that motivates this is the Timaeus. So in Proclus's commentary on the Timaeus, he comments on this weird thing that at the beginning of Timaeus's monologue, he says, well, whenever we start something, anyone with good sense should first of all pray to the gods. And then he doesn't give a prayer, right? And and then this is a puzzle. Like he says, oh, we should always pray whenever we start, and then he just starts without praying.
Mm.
Um, and the Proclus then elaborates this into a kind of um, infinite regress. Like, if you always have to pray before you start anything for so that it goes well, don't you have to then pray before you pray, right? And well, that makes no sense. So that means that wanting to pray is already a prayer, right? And so just the desire to pray is already like prayer, and so it can't be a process that has an end. It has to be fulfilled in itself, and so it's already this wanting to pray or is already attaching yourself to the gods, and that's why you don't actually need a separate prayer. Well, you say we should pray, right? That is already a prayer. And I think that's also behind this idea of praying as an activity. Um, the praying as an activity also might have to do with theurgic versus contemplative virtue, because if prayer wasn't an activity, then contemplative virtue would be obviously better than theurgy, because it would be an activity, whereas theurgy would just be a process. Um,
Right. So, and there's like a word play or something that says that pray means
right, yeah,
to you, like that.
yeah. So he's deriving prayer. So prayer is, or to pray, euchestai, from on the one hand, which means good, and echein, right, which is to have, or rather echestai, which is from echein, which is to claim, right? So, yeah.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah, so what's the point of this? Oh, just that the becoming dead and the being dead is two different kinds of things, but sometimes they're the same thing.
Yeah, and also to explain why he uses both words.
Hmm. Okay. Now, 52. There's correspondence between possession and privation. The philosopher's life is outside the body, right? The ordinary man is mixed up with it. Accordingly, to the ordinary man, loss of life means death. To the philosopher, however, it means the life determined by the body. So loss of this life, meaning.
Right. So that's he's commenting on this thing that the many do not understand, the way that the philosopher is practically dead, right? And the ordinary man thinks the philosopher is practically dead because he does not live a bodily life, right? He's always thinking, and he's always speculating, and falling in wells and things like that. Whereas the philosopher agrees, I'm hardly living, but not because my head is in the clouds. I'm hardly living because I'm still in a body, right? And life in
Okay.
a body is death, right? So they both, they say the same thing, but they mean opposite things.
Okay. Outsiders fail to see that the subject of the death for which the philosopher appears himself is the soul, not the living organism, which is like this life. Its character is life pure and unalloyed, not bodily death. Its cause is the pursuit of wisdom, not suicide. This last fact is expressed in the words how they long for death. The first, and by in what respect they deserve death. Right? In what respect? In the respect that they deserve death uh, in regards to soul, um, meaning,
Right,
trying to read it. While the words what kind of death indicate the character of this death, that is a life without admixture.
right. So, let's take it by part. So the subject of the death is different, and that also indicates also that the and character here is form, right? Eidos. Um, and so for the philosopher, death is an activity. It's not something that happens to him, right? So for the um, common person, dying is something that happens to you and happens to you as a body soul composite. The body soul composite breaks down, right? The soul leaves the body. The For the philosopher, it's the soul which leaves the body, and so it's active. And what it does is to die is to uh, lead or live a pure life, right? And that's also why the cause is different. The cause is pure pursuit of wisdom, right? As you pursue wisdom, you um, uh, and the term in Greek is philosophy, right? Philosophy is the cause, and not suicide. Um, and then that's the how. In what respect? So yeah, so I think that that's just a dative relative pronoun uh in the Greek, and I think he's taking it as to indicate like what part of them deserves, has a connection with death, and so it's the soul, not the composite, and then what kind has to do with the whether it's life or death. So he's just tacking these distinctions onto the Greek text.
Again, it's just that the what life and death means are reversed for the philosopher, basically.
Basically, with the additional that then since they're reversed, and also the subject is different, and whether it's an activity or a passion is different. Yeah,
All right. Okay. Socrates 54. Socrates defines the character of a discussion whose aim is purification by excluding the crowd from it and reserving it for the worthy. Even these are not admitted unrestrictedly, but they are required to turn into themselves, um, revert to themselves, and this is not to all. but they are told to turn to reason from the irrational way of life. Such is the meaning of the sentence, let us talk among ourselves, so also internally among ourselves, and not bother about the crowd.
Yeah. So uh right, the that's at the end, right? It says they are not aware of the way true philosophers are nearly dead, nor of the way they deserve to be, nor of the sort of death they deserve. Never mind them, he said, let us talk amongst ourselves. So that's uh that's the thing. So they have to turn to themselves because they'll be developing these arguments and away from the irrational way of life. So this is conceivably from Proclus as well, and then that matches onto the idea that so this distinction between rational and irrational is really important for Proclus. He thought that irrational has to do with the Titanic and rational with the Olympian, so it's moving away from the Titanic elements.
Hmm.
And now we get what the translator has called the definition of death. So I share that here. Do we believe that there is such a thing as death? Certainly, said Simmias. Is it anything else than the separation of the soul from the body? Do we believe that death is this, namely that the body comes to be separated by itself apart from the soul, and the soul comes to be separated by itself apart from the body? Is death anything else than that? No, that is what it is, he said. Um, so this by itself, that's a katauto, it's the same terminology that we see for forms in Plato, and um, it's anyway. We'll see. This is the first syllogism that he sees a syllogism implicit here, and it's we'll see how he diagrams a syllogism, which is quite cool. Okay.
Okay. So the first assumption um, does not pertain to the question of if death exists. This was evident, but whether it is something and has a certain definite quality, or whether it is a kind of privation and lack of definite form.
So
Okay.
that's how he interprets that first question. We agree that death is something.
Okay. Um, the philosopher, and here there's a picture, detaches himself from the body, longs to die.
Right. So this is how they diagram syllogisms. We might encounter a couple of others, well, this is more prominent in other places in the commentary. So they write like subject, predicate, predicate, and then they do a line between the subject and the first predicate and the second predicate and the third predicate, and then a line, therefore, by transitivity, as it were, from the subject to the last predicate. So the philosopher detaches himself from the body, then you have to add something like who or what detaches himself from the body longs to die, therefore the philosopher longs to die. Right?
I see.
And so that's their standard way of writing out syllogisms. Um, and so the right, and then he'll explain that in the 57.
Okay. I would picture it differently for some reason. Okay. The minor premise of the hypothetical syllogism is proved by means of a categorical syllogism, meaning the detaching himself from body and longing to die. The middle
Right.
term of
Yeah,
which is definition of death. This indeed is reason for introducing it.
right. So the philosopher longs to die is supposed to be the minor premise of the hypothetical syllogism. So remember that was like if achieving one's end always causes joy, um, and if our aim is to detach the soul from the body, then and to achieve complete detachment, then the philosopher should be happy when he detaches himself. So that's
Right.
the philosopher longs to die. And the point of, as it says, the point of introducing a definition of death is to make it clear that is to connect the two, the philosopher and longing to die, with this idea of detach himself from the body. Right.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Okay. And now, in deductive proof, a definition can be used, sometimes of the subject, as in the features of the soul, sometimes of the predicate, as in the philebus of the good. In order to demonstrate that pleasure is not the good, it explains what it gives the definition of the predicate, which is good. Does that make sense? Um, the definition of death given here is another instance.
Right. So here the so again the syllogism is the philosopher detaches himself from the body, what detaches himself from the body longs to die. Um, so here he's using the definition to attach the second predicate to the third, not the subject to the first predicate. The Phaedrus argument is the soul moves itself. What moves itself is ungenerated or is immortal. And the Philebus one I don't quite remember, but that's he's just making a general point that the definition can be used in both cases.
Okay. Um, definition, yeah. So now continue. 59. The definition has all the points a definition should have. Okay. It is evident for this is all like putting Aristotle's rules of logic into Plato. Um,
Exactly, and showing that Plato knows them beforehand and obeys them, and Plato's better than Aristotle is.
mhm. It is evident, for if life is admittedly a union of soul and body, death must be the reverse. That's that's like obvious. It is brief. That's number two. It being expressed in the necessary minimum of words. Three, it is also exact because one, it deals with death as a state, not as a process. It describes the state of death, right? Two, the death it describes its total death, which detaches from the soul from the body as well as the body from the soul, unlike something which would be only half of it. I don't know how that would be. Um, Three, with regard to the soul, it speaks of being. With regard to the body, of having become. That would be because the body doesn't have being or something like that. Um,
Right.
and finally, the definition of scientific because death being twofold, it covers the whole kind, which comprises both the aspects, so both the separation from body of from soul and soul from body.
Right. The so yeah, it's a bit about Plato. I mean, it's a bit about Aristotle, but there are Platonic elements here too. So three, with regard to the soul, it speaks of being with regard to the body as having become. That's Plato in the Timaeus. We have to use becoming with respect to bodies and perceptual things, and being with respect to other things. Um, and yeah, so it's total death. And you said, well, how could it be otherwise? Well, that's uh the distinction is, well, you can separate the soul from the body, and that's what the philosopher does, and then and then the death becomes complete, and then he moves on and goes to contemplate forms because the soul is alone. Or the the soul cannot separate from the body, and then the body separates from it, and then the soul becomes a ghost or transmigrates into animals because it led an irrational life and so on. And therefore, it's not a total death in that sense, and that would be how you could separate the body from the soul without the soul separating from the body.
Hmm.
Um, and it then covers, and it's complete because then it covers all the different kinds of death in this.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, and it's better it's exact to deal with death as a state and not as a process because the process is the process to the state, and therefore the if you want to give a proper definition, you have to give the state, not the process.
Okay. 60. Death, as defined here, is not the death of a form of life attached to a substrate, since it cannot free itself from the body and lead a separate existence. Um, so not death like death of Aristotle's forms, right? Or,
Right. Yeah, yeah.
um, which can't be separate. So that would be a half a death also, right? Because there's a separation from the of the form from the body, but there isn't, or I don't know how you would call it, like something. There's a breakdown of whatever it is combining these two things, but they don't then exist separately. Um,
Right. Whereas in the definition just given, he underlines that the body comes to be separated by itself apart from the soul. The soul comes to be separated by itself apart from the body. Yeah.
mhm. Nor does it ever apply to perfect souls, those of gods and genii, whose bodies cannot exist by themselves separated from their souls. Um,
Right. So this is you see, before he translated when he was talking about material daimonis, he translated it as demons. Here he translated it as
oh,
genie, right? Genii. But it's daimon
okay.
again.
The point is things that always have a body.
Hmm.
Um, but it belongs to the intermediate form, like human souls, which in which part can exist without the other.
Right. Yeah. Which have separate souls, but their bodies can exist separate from them.
Hmm. So these gods have separate souls, but would never their bodies. It's the bodies being more dependent on on the soul than the human bodies, basically.
Exactly. So
Something like
true.
because the human body has another form, like Aristotle's, the immanent form, something like that.
Yeah. It does. I mean, the bodies of the gods also have an immanent form in them. Um, but they are more dependent on they can't separate themselves from the their causes. That's more of a thing about the weakness of the human soul, right? That it can abandon the body.
Mm. Something like it doesn't unite its body eternally, something like that.
Exactly. It doesn't give it as good a form, right, as the divine souls do.
Okay. Now, oops. Death is twofold also under another point of view. On the one hand, it is a striving upwards to the superior, so on the point of the soul. On the other, a tending downwards to the inferior, which is, I guess, upon this part of the body.
Right. Yeah.
In connection with human souls, as Plato mentions both in the Gorgias, the death that brings us down to the body as a tomb. That's the first, that's being born, really, right? And in the present passage, the death that is the deliverance and the resurrection from the body.
Right. Right. And you can also think, you know, about this the connection that, the death that brings us down to the body as a tomb. So if you remember, like Proclus does think that we have these bodies that are always with us, which are our astral bodies, and normally we're up there amongst the stars. And when we come down here, we leave there, right? And so, in a sense, death happens there in the sense that people leave, right? Which is like what happens here with death, people leave. And and so that would be, that's one death that brings us down, but then there's the breath, the death that takes us back up. You
Hmm.
And so yeah, the first death is something like becoming mortal, and the other death is being freed from mortality. Then there's going to be another meaning of death here in 40 and 62.
62. From the point where differentiation among the gods begins, there is a descending scale of death as the principle that bestows the life of the prior upon the secondary. Hmm? so that even after procession, the product is in its cause to reversion. And the reverting deity entity being, as it were, stripped of its own life. So in sleep, we have reversion while the subject survives, and such is death for all everlasting beings. I don't understand. The lowest form, I'm going to try to understand. The lowest form of death is that of individual animals, as commonly understood, the death of the earthly body. There will also be an intermediate from the death of the pneumatic animals, amongst them the so-called longeval ones.
Right. So yeah, there's a lot to understand here. So first, from the point where the differentiation among the gods begins. So there's in the intelligible, there is not yet differentiation amongst the gods. All the gods are present together in being, and they all are in each other. Right? So it's only in the what's called the intelligible intellectual, right, that we start getting a distinction of many different levels of being. And another name for this intelligible intellectual is, ironically, life. Um, and he says, there's death. Why death? Well, think of the second kind of death that he just mentioned. The death that is a deliverance and a resurrection from the body. So here, death is a positive principle that gives a higher life to the lower thing, right? And so he says, every case that we have something being receiving a higher kind of life from its causes that we can call death. And that's the principle of death. And he associates with this with the idea that every um, product is in its cause um, uh, through reverting to it, right? The reverting entity being, as it were, stripped of its own life. Um, and so we can think here of like Kronos eating his children. For Proclus, this is a symbol of how the intellectual gods are all contained in the primary intellectual god, right? So he doesn't let them outside himself; they're all in himself, right? And and of course they come out later, but that's as it were a secondary. That happens afterwards in the myth, and it's a secondary form of activity of theirs. Also, when we were reading Proclus's commentary on the Republic, he commented on Hera seducing Zeus so that he would fall asleep, right? And there, Proclus said, falling asleep is actually acting like his cause, is assimilating him to his cause, and which is Cronus, right? And Um, so that's because there when he's awake, he's paying attention to things. He's using perception, so he's associating with lower things. But when he's asleep, he's like Cronus, which is separate from all that. And I guess this would also be of principle for understanding, like if there was a myth that talked about the death of a god, or something like that, that would be this would be the principle to apply. Well, death up there just means that the higher life gives its life to the secondary thing. I guess this is why in like comic books and some fantasy or action series, no one really ever dies. They're just always getting a higher life. Um, and And so that's the principle here. Death as a principle of reversion, right? Um,
And then,
then
right.
then there's a thing about the lowest form of death, right? And
Now,
which
what's this thing with the subject surviving and all everlasting beings? Something like
so
it's not complete reversion, or reversion is never supposed to be like destroying the effect, right?
exactly. So the normal form of reversion doesn't destroy the effect, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the death for all everlasting beings. You can say that all everlasting beings are dead, or better, that they're all asleep, right? You could say that maybe they're all dreaming, right? And um, and so that gives a different spin to these prayers of like, God, wake up, God, don't be asleep, we need you, and things like that. But anyway, so the lowest form of death is, and so that also explains why the lowest form of death is that of individual animals, because here the subject dies, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then there would be the intermediate form, the death of the pneumatic animals. So this has to do with the idea that there's a separate so just as we have our astral body and we have our mortal body, and between the two we have the pneumatic body. So in the cosmology that the Platonists take from the myth at the end of this book, at the end of the Phaedo, they understand that there's the true Earth, right? We're actually here seeing in a kind of watery medium. But if you go high enough, then you go to the ether where everything is clear and you can do like perfect astronomy and things like that. And there, that's the realm of pneuma. So there, the pneuma that here is always encased in a material body which has mass, there exists on its own. So pneuma, if we think of like pneuma as it's our image, it's this matter that responds immediately to our thinking and to our imagination and things. So there would be, as it were, like an imaginal world made up of imagination. Things there don't really have mass. That's also why they're up there. They're touching the heavens. Um, and there he talks, there are super long-lived things, and those are the longeval ones. And it's like our pneumatic bodies, right? Our pneumatic bodies last through many incarnations. But there are living beings that don't go all the way down to get a terrestrial body. They just have long pneumatic bodies. And the I guess it's where possibly, like, what kind of living beings are there? Well, Proclus says, for instance, that there's a daimon that rules over, oh, just wrote about this, right? The daimons that rule over cities and clans and things like that.
Right. But these
And,
do die, or maybe die only
right.
like once in 1,000 years or whatever.
Yeah, they die once in 1,000 years, and that would match, for instance, a daimon that watches over a clan, because clans and cities do become extinct, right? And although some seem to be forever for Proclus, and I mean, in antiquity, there were cities that were reputed to be forever, but I mean, Rome is still standing. But anyway,
I mean,
there's
yeah, I guess questions if it's the same realm.
yeah, is it the same Rome, of course, but there are families that do trace their ancestry back to the realm, to ancient Rome. So, but in any case, whether that's historical or not, different question. But anyway, um, so we could, of course, those things don't have material bodies, right? You don't, but we could think that they have just pneumatic bodies, right? So maybe they're living up there, and maybe, I don't know, other, long-lived symbols might live up there. I don't know.
Mm,
But for Proclus and Damascus and like those, it's a just the same way that the Tartarus is a place of punishment, that's a place of reward, right? Life is easy there, and you can and things like that. So those are the long-lived ones, and they would have an intermediate kind of death. I wonder what this means, though. Does it mean so here, our individual animals, we they die, and then so the body is destroyed. There, does the body is the body not destroyed? It could be because the when Damascus discusses recollection, right, and amnesis, he discusses also the case of Pythagorean memories, right? So it's like Pythagoras saying, "Oh, I see this shield and it was me," and I start crying. It's like, how does this happen? And he says it's something like, and of course, Pythagoras is like a pure soul that just comes down um, to educate people, right? It didn't have, doesn't go through the cycle of transmigration. It always comes down as a human being to teach and then it goes back up. And he says it's like, oh, it's because it picked up this pneumatic body with these memories when it was coming down. So presumably for that to happen, the pneumatic bodies have to stick around somehow. That's the best way that I can explain
Hmm.
that. Um, the but there is something puzzling here about what would be the middle form of death. What's middle about it? Does the thing die and not die at the same time? I'm not sure.
Something like there is the pride, like the highest form of death is where uh, you never lose the subject never loses itself or the effect.
It,
The lowest one is where it entirely loses itself, and the intermediate one would be like something where it sometimes loses itself or something like that.
Something like that, or only partly loses itself. How does that? Yeah, I'm not really sure how to cash that out.
This is
Um,
like this whole thing is like very sad because we would have thought that like one thing we can do well is die, and it's like no, you can't even die as good as the gods.
yeah, I guess. I guess.
Like mortals, no, it's the gods that are really immortal because they have real reversion.
Yeah, but I guess that has to do with the fact that so the first gods that constitute changing things, which are the primary gods to do with the soul, the hypercosmic gods, are called the assimilative gods. They're the gods of likeness, because down here everything is derivative. Everything that changes has to have its model up there, and so even death has its model up there. And so yeah, we just can't do any like uh, there's it's like an anti-Heideggerian even, right? Because like Heidegger's like, no, you're the most authentic, the most personal thing you have is your death. Like, no, even your death is a bad copy of what gods are doing. Yeah, so you can't that's even not. Um so
And sort
um
of like the tragedy of death is precisely because of that. That you can't dying well would be staying alive.
yeah. Yeah. And I guess and I guess like what is dying well here then? Well, dying well is imitating the true death, right? Which is reversion, which is separating your soul from your body and reverting to your higher causes. And so that's dying well. Dying well is like don't try to do your own thing in dying. Try to imitate the best dyers. Um, okay. Um, and now we get into the discourse on detachment, which is so here there's a few general points that he makes, that's 63 to 67, right? And so you see that he comments here 64d2 to 66a10. That's what the translator set it out. But then he goes like point by point, right? So the first point, the philosopher despises physical pleasure, that's 68 to 73. And then the 3 points in the progress of the soul, the second point. So it all goes quite, he really he has the general things and then the specific commentaries. So let me just share the passage and we'll continue. Where is this? Okay. Okay, so he starts. Consider then, my good sir, whether you share my opinion, for this will lead us to a better knowledge of what we are investigating. Do you think it is the part of a philosopher to be concerned with such so-called pleasures as those of food and drink? That's the first point. By no means. What about the pleasures of sex? Not at all. What of the other pleasures concerned with the service of the body? Um, do you think such a man prizes them greatly, the acquisition of distinguished clothes and shoes and other bodily ornaments? Do you think he values these or despises them, except insofar as one cannot do without them? I think it's them.
Yes.
Do you not think, he said, that in general such a man's concern is not with the body, but that as far as he can, he turns away from the body and towards the soul? I do. So in the first place, such things show clearly that the philosopher, more than other men, frees the soul from the associations with the body as much as possible, apparently. A man who finds no pleasure in such things and has no part in them is thought by the majority not to deserve to live and to be so close to death. The man, that is, who does not take care for the pleasures of the body, which is certainly true. Then what about actual acquiring of knowledge? Is the body an obstacle when one associates with it in the search for knowledge? I mean, for example, do men find any truth in sight or hearing, or are not even the poets forever telling us that we do not see or hear anything accurately? And surely if those two physical senses are not clear or precise, other senses can hardly be accurate, so as they are all inferior to these. Do you not think so? So this is another point about the acquiring of knowledge, that the body is an impediment. I certainly do, he said. When then, he asked, does the soul grasp the truth? For whenever it attempts to examine anything with the body, it is clearly deceived by it. True. Is it not in reasoning, if anywhere, that any reality comes clear to the soul? Um, yes, and indeed the soul reasons best when none of these senses troubles it, neither hearing nor sight nor pain nor pleasure, when it is both by itself taking leave of the body and as far as possible having no contact or association with it in its search for reality. That is so. And it is then that the soul of the philosopher most disdains the body and flees from it, ceases to be by itself. It appears so. What about the following, Simmias? Do we say that there is such a thing as the just itself or not? We do. We do say so by Zeus, and the beautiful and the good, of course. And so this is the third point about the forms. And have you ever seen any of these things with your eyes? In no way, he said. Or have you ever grasped them with any of your bodily senses? And speaking of all such things as bigness, health, strength, and in a word, the reality of all other things, that which each of them is essentially is what is most true in them contemplated through the body, or is the position whoever of us prepares himself best, most accurately to grasp that thing itself which he is investigating, will come closest to the knowledge of it, obviously, and he will do this most perfectly who approach the object with thought alone, without associating any sight with his thought or dragging in any sense perception with his reasoning, but who, using pure thought alone, tries to track down each reality pure and by itself, freeing himself as far as possible from eyes and ears and in a word from the whole body, because the body confuses the soul and does not allow it to acquire truth and wisdom whenever associated with it. Will not that man reach reality? Simmias, if anyone does, what you say, said Simmias, is indeed true. So he makes three points here where you might associate just two, because he separates the general point that we know worse with the body than with thought from the point that the form specifically can only be grasped separately from the body. So those are the 3 points. You despise physical pleasure, you want to know well, and that you want to know the forms. So let's then start reading his general remarks here at 63.
Okay. 63. The object of this passage is to arrive at a clear understanding of the soul's life separate from the body. This tends to make us aware of the immortal life. Socrates in the Republic too insists that we should not regard the soul as mortal because of the crust of seaweed that covers it.
Right. Crust of seaweed, that's associated with the idea that I mean, it's a source for the idea that the terrestrial body is like an oyster, right? It's an oyster with a bunch of seaweed around it. The this tends to make us aware of the immortal life. The aware here is uh, aesthesis, it's perception. It gives us a perception of the immortal life. So there's awareness, can be rather vague, and whereas perception suggests that you have a contact with some unique, object, a concrete object. Um, and yeah, and so the life separate from the body makes us aware of the immortal life. Right? Um, okay.
Okay. Soul, 64. Soul must necessarily be either body or incorporeal, in which latter case there are two possibilities. Either it has an incorporeal existence of its own, or it exists in a material substrate. It is not a body since it is capable of scorning the body, nor it is in the body since it is capable of opposing it. Therefore, it has complete and independent incorporeality. That is what the present discourse proves.
Right. And later in the Phaedo, he explicitly makes this point, right? So when he's arguing against the soul is a harmony. So how could it be a harmony if it opposes its bodily, its body, right? And also, it we we saw these two ways of being incorporeal in the elements, right? Because he first argues that the soul is incorporeal, and then also that it has a separate existence, because power in a body, for instance, heat is also itself incorporeal, right? But it depends on the body. And also, of course, the Aristotelian forms, right? Um, so that's why he denies both. And so here he distinguishes between scorn and opposing the body. So scorn, so it can distinguish itself from it, but opposition means that it can like stop the body doing what it does, and therefore it has to have its own power and existence, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why he distinguishes the two.
Okay. Let me continue. Let's see. 65. Socrates demonstrates the minor of the categorical syllogism, i.e., the proposition that the philosopher detaches himself from the body. To this end, he uses three lines of argument. One, the argument from the inferior, the soul can rise above all bodily effects. Two, the argument derived from soul itself, when staying by itself, attains perfection and contemplates both itself and reality. Three, the argument from the superior, the intelligible forms. If the soul can enter into contact with transcendent entities, it must have an activity transcending the body. Interesting. Um, it must have an activity. And if so, the same is true a fortiori of its essence, because because activity is weaker, is less than essence. For contact through the body is unthinkable.
Yeah. So essence here translates ousia, right? So it's not just what it is, but it's existing as what it is. And here are the 3 points that he'll divide this discourse on detachment to, and he connects them all with proving the minor of the categorical syllogism. So remember that the categorical syllogism itself was in service of the hypothetical syllogism before. And so this is part like he's showing that the Phaedo is one long argument, right? And it's not just a series of, and so he gives you one argument, and then he proves the premises of that, and then the premises of that, and so on.
Mhm.
And the it's this thing that if the soul can enter in contact with transcendent entities, so transcendent here means separate, is translation for separate, separately existing from the body. It must have an activity transcending these, and then it also has is a fortiori of its essence. It's interesting that in the elements, we saw that Proclus also demonstrates the separateness of the soul through knowing higher things, but in a different way. There he says the soul naturally reverts to its cause, which is a nous. But if it knows nous, it knows itself as an effective nous. And then if it knows itself, then it reverts upon itself and has to have a separate existence. Right. So whereas here it's, if it knows something that's separate from the body, the activity is separate, so the user has to be separate. It's a different kind of argument than the one we find in the elements. So let's stop here, and we'll pick
Okay.
up from here next time.
Yeah, we should. Okay, thank you.
Okay, great. Next week is fine?
I
28th?
think so. Hope so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For me, it's fine. Okay.
I'll check. Okay. Yeah. Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Bye bye. Have a good week.
You too.